Famously, Charlotte Bronte spent many hours of her childhood creating fantastical worlds with her siblings, primarily Anne and Emily and Branwell. They created, for example, a world called Gondel, another world called Angria. And essentially, these became little universes into which they could pour their imaginations, creating characters both realistic and fantastical at the same time. A world of make believe constructed by a community of like minded young children. This activity, of course, allowed the Bronte children to pass many a dreary hour in Haworth, uh, where they were quite isolated. They had their father there and their aunt there, uh, but not much else to do. They certainly did a good bit of reading, the Bible, obviously. Their father was a minister. They were also allowed to read such scandalous authors as Lord Byron. But in addition to the draw of these little fictional world for simply keeping boredom at bay, uh, Charlotte Bronte in particular was very much enamored of the idea of fantasy, folklore, fairy tale, creating her own essentially folk tales, fairy lore, and whatnot for much of her childhood. So it certainly makes sense that by the time we get to her first published novel, Jane Eyre, that elements of a fairy tale will figure mightily, not only in the development of Jane's character, in the development of her relationship with Rochester, but indeed in the structure of the overall novel. Just quickly, we can rattle off how popular fairy tales show up in the novel. The story of Bluebeard is there, where Jane goes to Thornfield Hall, and there is a potentially violent, dark featured man who seems to have a dark secret. Well, it turns out, of course, he is keeping his wife imprisoned in the attic because, of course, she's, according to him and others, mentally ill. But there's a sense that there is an aura of violence and terror surrounding Rochester, reminiscent again of Bluebeard, who slays his wives. We also have the story of Beauty and the Beast, with Jane seeing in Rochester beastly characteristics. He's not traditionally handsome, he's not conventional, he's gruff, but yet through her love, he becomes more human, more humane, more civilized, more Christian. Little Red Riding Hood, again with Jane as the innocent little girl, diminutive Jane, showing up at Thornfield Hall, and there Rochester is something of the big bad wolf. Could go on. It seems that Jane uses these larger narrative structures, not Jane, but Charlotte Bronte. It seems that Charlotte Bronte uses these larger narrative structures, certainly to imbue her tale, which has very acutely observed realistic qualities, to imbue her tale with the kind of the power of the fantastical, the archetypal energy of folklore that is there. But in more specific ways, Charlotte Bronte uses the imagery of fairy lore to describe a certain aspect of Jane's character. There is the Jane that follows the rules. There's the Jane that makes good grades. There's the Jane that knows how to please the right people to get ahead in the world. Not in an ambitious way. She's a governess. But she endures at Lowood because she learns again how to follow the rules. She endures as a teacher at Lowood, same. And once she becomes governor of Adele in Thornfield Hall, she also is someone who is conventional in some ways. She wants to be a proper Englishwoman, and her goal is to teach Adele to be a proper, educated Englishwoman. But then there is another part of Jane which shows up early on in her justified attacks on Miss Reed. And this Jane shows up in the famous Red Room sequence. Jane is put in a red room as punishment for lashing out at her cousin John Reed. And in this room where her uncle died, a room that is rarely used in the house, Gateshead, she sees herself in the mirror and she says, "When I looked in the mirror, it's as if I saw another person." And she's 10 years old at this time. All looked colder and darker in that visionary hollow mirror than in reality. And the strange little figure there gazing at me with a white face and arms specking the gloom and glittering eyes of fear moving where all else was still had the effect of a real spirit. I thought it like one of the tiny phantoms, half fairy, half imp, Bessie's evening stories represented as coming out of lone, ferny dells and moors and appearing before the eyes of belated travelers. I returned to my stool. So it's fair to say that there are different versions of Jane Eyre. There is the proper conformist version that I described, but then there's this wild, nonconformist, rebellious Jane Eyre. And this side of Jane Eyre is often described in terms of fairy lore. And even in a more particular way, this side of Jane, manifested most in her relationship with Rochester, is seen, at least by Rochester, as what makes her most attractive. So, for instance, when Jane first meets Rochester out in the countryside, she's gone out for a walk, she's out, it's twilight, and she hears a horse clattering metallically, and she sees a huge beast running. Turns out it's the dog, and she thinks, "Oh my gosh, this is like a Jai-trash," which is a sort of, let me read you what it is, a fantastical creature from the realm of fairy lore that, again, Bessie tells her about. Bessie's the one who passes on to Jane all the fairy tales. So it was exactly one mask of Bessie's Jai-trash, a lion-like creature with long hair and a huge head. It passed me, however, quietly enough, not staying to look up, with strange, Peter Canine eyes in my face, as I half expected it would. Now, again, it turns out that this is just a dog, but this points to the fact that the first time Jane meets Rochester, it's an encounter imbued with the supernatural, the fantastical. She initially thinks that he might be a figure from a fairy world. And even when she realizes it's not, part of what draws her to Rochester are his, let's call them folkloric qualities, his qualities that might remind, again, of Bluebeard or of the Big Bad Wolf. She also admires that he's unconventional. He tells her stories of his libertine behavior from younger times. That has nothing to do with the fairy lore, but again, if we see fairy as a concept in Jane Eyre, it becomes a concept to mark what doesn't fit within everyday conventional conformist understanding. That's the kind of imagery Jane uses. So the fairy lore, as it pertains to Jane and Rochester, is a realm not only of the fantastical, not only of the potentially supernatural, but also of the rebellious and the sexual. Jane finds the outrayness, let's say, of Rochester, the Byronesque qualities, the Byronic qualities of Rochester, the qualities that would attach him to a Bluebeard or a beast or a big bad wolf, as sexy. And same Rochester toward Jane. He tells Jane, Oh, well, when I first met you, I thought you were a creature from another world. And when she returns from visiting Miss Reed, who has died, and she says, I've returned from Miss Reed, who is dead, he says, oh, it looks like you've come from the world of the dead. These are only two of many examples where he refers to her as a sprite or an elf or a fairy or something along those lines. So we can contrast these images attached to Jane, these folkloric images, these images of fairy lore, with uh, other women in the novel who indeed turn out to be poor examples of womanhood, at least in Jane's eyes, and ultimately in Rochester's eyes. So there is Blanche Ingram, who has no mysteriousness about her whatsoever. She's very obviously out to marry Rochester for his money. Miss Reed, no mysteriousness for her either. She is brutally aristocratic and classist and looks down on Jane because Jane does not fit within a traditional idea of what a child should be. What should children be like in Miss Reed's eyes? Well, like her own. Georgiana, Eliza, and John, all of whom are conventional upper class children, all of whom turn out very poorly, mainly because they're so locked in on highly conventional values. At the other extreme, there's Bertha, who also is imbued with the supernatural. She is referred to as a vampire at one point. She's referred to as a demon at another point. So you have, on the one hand, these women who are boringly conventional. You have, on the other hand, Bertha, who is terrifyingly unconventional and also suggestive of the supernatural, but the supernatural as sinister, even though certainly there is an erotic energy to her. And Jane would be in the middle. Her most attractive qualities being supernatural in this more sort of rural Midsummer Nights like realm of fairies. So we can call this one Gothic element of Jane Eyre, that the romance of Rochester and Jane is distinguished, at least in its early stages, by these heightened, potentially supernatural energies, exciting, mysterious, charming, a little unsettling. And the sexuality between the two of them is far from a conventional sexuality. It's a sexuality charged with a kind of magic. Well, what happens? By the end of the novel, one can say this is lost. This fairy romance, let's call it, because, first of all, Rochester no longer has these folkloric qualities. He has, in some ways, been castrated, figuratively speaking. He's lost his eyes and he's lost his hand. He no longer has that masculine vitality, that strangeness that Jane so admires. And also, he's penitent. He knows he's sinned and he wants to find repentance. And Jane is no longer this fairy spirit necessarily. She's more a kind of Christian helpmate. She guides him in his darkness. She helps him to his repentance. And then she becomes his traditional wife, and they have children. So what does that say about fairy lore in the novel? I would say this, that whether Charlotte Bronte intended this or not, in some ways this novel is a kind of agon between the pagan world and the Christian world. And the Christian world on the surface wins out, even to the point where St. John, the fervently pious, violently pious missionary, gets the last word. So if on the surface the novel Christianity kind of wins out, and we see Jane on a sort of pilgrim's progress towards salvation. Um, on a covert level, the fairy power probably prevails, because I imagine most of us find those qualities in Jane and find those qualities in a romance with Rochester to be the most powerful parts of the book. Uh, that it seems that Charlotte Bronte has the heart of a pagan, meaning someone who embraces the world of nature energy, who embraces the world of mystery and strangeness, who embraces Gothic experience, but yet ultimately, for whatever reason, maybe her upbringing, maybe her desire to be proper herself, comes down the side of Christianity, at least overtly. So that's a meditation on how fairy elements play into the novel Jane Eyre, uh, an albeit somewhat partial view, because there are other things we certainly could have focused on in terms of fairy lore in the novel. But I feel like this gets to the core of it, that we have two Janes, and to some extent we have two Rochesters to some extent. There's the fairy Jane and the more conventional Jane, and there's the fairy Rochester and the more, at the end of the novel, conventional Rochester.